So my name's Gibson Burrell, and I was born and brought up in Ashington. Born there in the late 40s. Actually born in Newcastle, but the first day of my life came to Ashington. Lived there till I was 18, till I went to university. But my brother still lived in Ashington after I graduated, and his family, and my grandmother and granddad, as well as my mother, lived in Ashington. So I would probably claim that I knew Ashington up till the early 80s. Then my mother became senile and was in Morpeth Cottage Hospital. So, if I did go back, it was going to Morpeth. So I know Ashington up till about the miners' strike, although I wasn't around during the miners' strike in Ashington itself.
So what was Ashington like when you were growing up?
It was always self-identified as the largest mining village in the world. I remember it as having all kinds of support mechanisms for people of my age. I remember a huge family. So the Burrells used to get a bus, a 30, 40-seater bus, and we'd fill it with all my dad's brothers and sisters. My mother was a single, an only child. So the Burrells would go away on bus trips. For the day, for the weekend sometimes, go to Blackpool quite often. So money was becoming available in that post-war period. By the 1960s, I think people felt as if they were well off. The street I'm from was called Rosalind Street. And the streets in my area, the Hurst, were all named after Shakespearean female characters. And it was an attempt to bring culture, obviously, to the miners. So you had a grid system, which was First Avenue, Second Avenue, etc. But going the other way was Rosalind Street, Ariel Street, Beatrice Street, and so on. The Charlton brothers, the famous footballers, lived in Beatrice Street, which was next to Rosalind Street. So I remember all that. I remember the '66 World Cup incredibly well. And there was a sense that, there was money, people enjoyed themselves, although you were constantly aware that people were dying down the pit. Accidents were an everyday, not an everyday, but a regular occurrence. 2 doors down from our house, a couple got married when they were 17, and I think after his honeymoon he'd been in work a couple of weeks, and some stone, that's what they used to say, stone fell on his back. He had a broken back and lived for about another 20 years, I think, looked after by his wife. There was a sense in which people were looked after, so he kept the house. He was given some sort of disability allowance, but to my knowledge, he never came out of the house in those 20 years. There wasn't any availability of mobility scooters or anything like that. And obviously his wife had a really, really tough time. The special thing about Ashington was often the club life, so people lived. There's an expression in looking at medieval sort of life which says people lived for beer and the bed. In other words, sex and alcohol. And there was a sense in that in Ashington in the 50s and 60s. So on a Friday night and a Saturday night, people went out. On a Friday night, couples, if they had babysitters, would go out separately. And then on a Saturday night, they'd go out together. And then on a Sunday night, the men would go out themselves. So if you hadn't any children, that was the regular sort of thing. There were 3 pubs, because the Duke of Portland, who owned the land, was a teetotaler. I think one of them, at least at the time it was being set up. So the Duke of Portland insisted there was only 1 pub for 30,000 people. And unsurprisingly, it was called the Portland Hotel. And that got it past him. And there was a Grand Hotel, which was for commercial travelers, people from the NCB, or before that from the Ashington Coal Company, to stay in. And then there was one pub that was on the outskirts of the Hurst, where I'm from, called the White Elephant. And that wasn't its real name, it was the North Seaton Hotel, but everybody assumed that it would be a White Elephant. Nobody would go to it. But alongside those 3 pubs were 55 clubs. So the way of getting past the Duke of Portland's teetotaling kind of ambitions was to make working men's clubs, and they were for men. Women were excluded from certain bars, and there was usually a lounge where women were allowed in at the weekends. But generally speaking, words were said if women walked into the bar. So very, very gendered society. My dad always gave my mother housekeeping. She never knew how much he had in his wage packet. And from that, she would give him spending money, but she'd no idea what he'd kept out already. So he gave her the housekeeping. And out of that, she had to buy him 300 Woodbines a week. And he smoked more than that. But of course, remembering that down the pit, they weren't allowed to smoke. So it was just chain smoking whenever he was above ground. So most of the family, all my uncles, in fact, worked for the NCB. None of my aunties worked. They saw themselves as housewives. The idea was that the NCB or the coal company would always give you a job, and that it became more and more secure as the years went by. So by the time the NCB had been established in 1948, I think there was an assumption that you had some security. And that security would be from injury or from death of your husband if you were a widow. Your life was not fantastic, but there was a roof over your head. And so there was a phrase certainly used in Northumberland to say that the highest level of security anybody could have is a colliery house. So if you said, oh, they've got a colliery house, that meant they were secure for life. They were established for life. And if you saw an actor on TV in the late 50s and they were on regularly, that's the phrase you would say, oh, they've got a colliery house, which meant a job, a regular job, regular income, and a roof over your head. So the image that I've got then is of increasing wealth, wealth's too strong, increasing sort of incomes around for people right into the 60s, one or two cars appearing, but another dimension to it was violence. And part of the gender issue was men were expected to be men by the women, but also they certainly expected to do it. And my father solved all his problems, as far as I knew, through violence, through challenging a people to a fight. He certainly did that to his brothers. He certainly inculcated that in his sons. So when my brother was 15, my dad took him into the yard, the yard in the house, and he said, look at those four walls, son. And my brother said, yes, Dad. And he said, if you ever go down the pit, and I'll have to do the finger, if you ever, probably the fist, if you ever go down the pit, I'll knock your head against every one of these walls. The same father, when I was about 9, we were walking back home together, and he said, do you trust me, son? I said, of course I do, Dad. He said, close your eyes then. So I closed my eyes, and he led me straight into a concrete lamppost. And I got this enormous shiner. And he said, without the fist, the finger this time, he said, let that be a lesson, son. Never trust anybody. So there was that real macho kind of view of life and how you got through it. And you solve your problems through violence because very few other people would. So, there was very strong undercurrents of violence. And there were particular families that were associated with being violent. And that's the way, of course, there was a strong police force as well. But problems used to get solved in that sort of way. There was no recourse to the law. You sorted things out yourself. So when you walk down the street as a boy, teenager, you were very aware of who was down the street, who was coming down the street, very narrow pavements, and you were making judgments all the time about who you stepped off for and who you didn't step off for. So that sort of life was of a collective kind of sense, but part of the collective is who are the strong people in it? Who are the ones that dominate? So this is a story about my mother. So when I was well into my 30s, I went home from living away, and she said, have you seen the Newcastle Journal today? And I said, of course not. I didn't say that, but no. And she said, and this is an invented name, she said, I see that Jimmy Smith has died in the births and deaths in the Newcastle Journal. And I said, oh yes. And she said, if I knew where they were burying him, I would go and spit on his grave. And, you know, for my mother to say that, my mum was a, you know, very a caring sort of person, never violent in her own way at all. But her view was that this guy had attacked her when she was pregnant with my sister, you know, her first child, and he'd sexually attacked her. And my dad had found out. She told him a certain way. But what she was concerned about was my dad had not gone and, you know, beaten him senseless. What my dad said was, okay, I'll never ever speak to him again. And he regarded that as more serious, as, you know, ostracizing somebody who had been his best friend, a really close friend. And that sense of ostracizing him, to him, was more serious than beating him up. But as far as my mother was concerned, she said, you know, that's what really annoyed me, that your dad did not go out and look for him straight away and beat him senseless, sort of thing, because she'd been attacked. But instead of reporting that, you know, which in some middle class communities, that's what would happen maybe, not necessarily by any means, she'd reported it to her husband straight away. And he hadn't done what she'd wanted, which was to use violence. Yeah? So it would be a mistake to think that women were not, you know, not part of a system which recognized the importance of violence. And just one thing on that, sorry. I think it's important to recognize in things like Billy Liar, I think, are totally inaccurate, because what you get is men swearing in front of women and children. And certainly in the 50s and 60s and 70s in Ashington, there was a very strong code that a man never swore in front of his wife or his children. And my nephew remembers working for his dad, and he never heard his dad swear in his 15, 16 years of existence. But he went to work for his dad on a building site. And was, you know, downstairs and somebody was upstairs working. And there was effing and blinding coming from upstairs. This was in Tasmania. Effing and blinding going on upstairs. And Mark, my nephew, said to the co-worker, who's that? And he said, well, it's your dad. And he, you know, till the age of 16, he'd never heard his dad swear. And I think that's much more typical. There was a real sense of, you swore in front of your mates whatever you wanted to say, but as soon as a woman came into a room, your demeanor changed, certainly your language changed, and you didn't swear in front of the kids. Now that's not to say that was true everywhere, but certainly in my experience, none of the Burrell men swore in front of their wives, girlfriends, or the kids. I think society was incredibly gendered anyway, and it, you know, it certainly reflected that sort of thing. But there was the notion of a male, working class, macho sort of culture where your status came from how hard you were. And that was accepted, you know, often by both gender. And if you're dealing with nature, which you obviously are down the pit, or if you're in a coal field or a steel worker, that sense of proving you're a hard man works. So my dad had lost the end of his thumb in an accident, and he allowed the nail to grow out as a hook. And instead of trimming it, as you know, you would think in middle class life you would, he just let it grow, and there it was a kind of a, you know, a badge of honor. He'd lost, you know, part of his hand to nature, you know, down the pit. And that's, I think that's true right across people bearing their battle scars. And the culture of the hard man, as we know, you know, you find right across the world. I mean, the South American machismo is part of that. You know, you show how hard you are through violence and so on, the ability to stand pain. So there was gendering in society, but I think it was reinforced certainly by the nature of the job. A lot of them as well, my dad never supported the Labour Party because the Labour Party in Ashington was seen as what we might say apparatchiks, you know, party officials. And he didn't like the way in which, you know, they feathered their own sort of nest. So whilst he would vote Labour, he was never a member of the Labour Party and in fact avoided that. But what he did join was the Freemasons. So Freemasonry in Ashington was really quite strong. And again, that cult of, you know, the male society, male friends, male, you know, drinking habits, socializing. And of course in the Masons the idea is before you join you bare your left breast and roll up your trouser leg to show you're not a woman. The gender nature of that was very strong, and women were never allowed to see the regalia. Always hidden under the bed it was. So the male culture was reinforced in many ways through work, through leisure activities like the Masons, but also in sport, of course. And football in Ashington has been incredibly strong. At Linemouth, when they put the shaft down, and I think that was in the 1920s, I'm not sure, maybe later, but a woman threw herself down and committed suicide while throwing herself down the shaft as they built it. And everyone said, that's unlucky. That pit will not survive. And so I think it lasted 60, 70 years, but that was enough. And you know, people were still saying when there was a big fire in Linemouth, that's because that woman committed suicide. So fatalism is another big thing. You know, so if you go to work and you know that it's very dangerous, fatalism becomes part of it, that if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. So there is a culture there of things that reinforce each other: leisure, social groups, work, belief systems, I think, all kind of fit together. In the literature, they talk about an isolated mass. So it's isolated from the rest of society, and it's a mass, and it becomes quite homogeneous. So lots of things are shared. And if you break the value system, there is a way in which you are ostracized, you know, you're told to go away, which I imagine is similar to Aboriginal society. But also, if you do decide to stay, your life can be made hell. And certainly, there were those people in Ashington that were seen as transgressing, you know, certain rules and values, that their life would be made very difficult. So anything to do with, you know, harassment of children, anything to do, I think, with, you know, extreme violence against a female would be deemed to be problematic. Not holding your drink, you know, becoming unpredictably violent. Again, you might be ostracized for that. People wouldn't go out with you, or they'd walk away from bars and so on. And that if you live in this isolated group of people, then, you know, that is a really strong way of exercising social control. But people did leave, but not many. I remember my brother telling me a story about someone who had been very, very violent, and I think his work colleagues had said, sorry, you know, you are so unpredictable. And this guy went, and he was very small in the story, and he went down to London, you know, obviously the worst place that one can possibly go to, and came back, and my brother and his mates were in the bar when he came in, and he was wearing a long sort of coat, you know, very nice, expensive looking coat. And they said, hi Jimmy, you know, what are you doing back? And he said, oh, I've just come back to see my mother. And they said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm a minder for a guy in London. And they looked him up and down, you know, he's very, very small. And they said, well, how come you're a minder? And he just opened the coat, and there was a sawn-off shotgun kind of hanging down on the inside. And so he was using, you know, the violence to some effect. But he was an example of somebody that I was told just beyond the pale in that level of unpredictability, and went and used it, and made a living or a death out of it. I don't know which. So there was that attitude, I think, to do with the way in which you followed norms, because these kind of communities are conservative with a small c and transgressing those. So my sister went to university in the early 50s. She went to Newcastle and lived at home. And we had a succession of visitors to the house who were from West Africa. So I remember a Ghanaian coming and a Nigerian coming to the house. And the neighbors had thought this was so remarkable, and I won't go into the language they use, the casual sort of racism, but that level of transgressing, that you're bringing these people into the street and we don't know anything about them, really strange sorts of people with their own cultures. And my sister just had to articulate why it was important that people in Ashington understood that we were still part of a commonwealth. Yeah, I think originally the Duke of Portland bought the land or the mining rights in the 1840s, 1850s. So Ashington has two parts. One is the top end, the westerly bit, where the Duke of Portland and the Portland Hotel is, and there are miners' cottages there, but they've got a fair bit of land, quite big gardens. And then the Hearst was built in 1914, 1915. And the Hearst is industrial barracks. There's no other word for it. And I've got a view that miners had become educated not to want land, because the original places where miners came to often had very large gardens. Because if they'd come from the land, one way of getting them to work underground was to give them that bridge, if you like, to their previous existence. So you can see this in Ashington if you move from the West End down into the Hearst. And the Hearst built in the pre-war period, row after row after row. You would know people in the street and so on. But that was because Woodhorn developed as a colliery. There was a railway line which took you to Linton and Linemouth and Ellington, as well as Ashington. So you've got to imagine Woodhorn, and there's also North Seaton where my granddad Mays worked. So there were 6 pits in the area, all owned by the Ashington Mining Company, making super profits, one imagines. But the Duke of Portland owned the bridge. It was a wooden bridge across the Wansbeck. And the story was that he got, for decades, or the family for decades, got 6p per ton for each wagon crossing the bridge as the payment for using his bridge. And 6p a ton. Each truck was 30 tons, and there would be 30 trucks per train, and the trains were running all day. So that is a huge amount of money that's going into the Portland family. The industrial barracks, I think, attracted people from lots of places. So on one side, on the male side of my family, the Burrells have lived in Northumberland within 20 miles of Alnwick, going back to about 1600. My sister's done the family tree, and the Burrells go back that far. Whereas on my mother's side, they came from Norfolk, and they were agricultural labourers, ag labs in the jargon, and they left in the 1890s. Both the parents of my grandparents, if you like, left separately, didn't know each other, but they must have met up in Bedlington. And my grandmother came to Bedlington with all her family. She remembers that it was near Bedlington Station, and there was like a floor upstairs and a rope ladder up to it, so it was one up, one down, and there were 6 girls and the parents living in a one up, one down, because all her sisters were born in Norfolk, and as she was, but they came and worked in Bedlington. And 2 things, I think one, it must have been the attraction of better money and at least a job in the northeast coalfield, but also pressure on the land. Mechanization on the land meant that people no longer had a job in the farming sort of area. I'm not aware of, quote, foreigners, people from abroad, but people came from all over the UK. I'm not aware of any Irish coming to the northeast, although that may well be the case. Yeah. So it was a polyglot sort of mixture. And where Pitmatic, the language of Ashington and the villages around, comes from, I don't know. But it is that mixture of Geordie and rural Northumbrian. And I presume that shows something about, the origins of the place. But Ashington itself started off in the 1800s, I think, as not even a hamlet. I think it was a farmhouse. I think that where would industrial workers, including miners, come from? And the answer is probably, the peasant line, agricultural labourers. And their relationship with the landowners, I think, would have always been a precarious one. They would have always felt as if they could have been thrown off the land. I know what my dad really objected to, and that was going into a stately home and paying for it. He would say, I'm not going to do that. He said, we've paid for it so many times already, through our sweat. Then to go and pay again, to go and see the spoils. So he would never ever go to Alnwick Castle. Not a great fan of the Duke and Duchess of Northumberland. So there was that, and my dad would always say, I'm never going to say please or thanks to anybody, because nobody says please or thanks to me about going down the pit. So there was an attitude there to property, if you like, that had been taken away. But going underground and working for somebody else, must create an attitude, I think, to nature, because nature would be seen as very, very threatening. Yeah, and anything you could control in nature, you would do. So this is the thing, I think, about allotments. Yeah, so it's like, your life is threatened by nature, but sometimes it's called the opposition pattern. So you do something totally different in your leisure time. So allotments, growing leeks, pigeons, having pigeon crees, pigeon sheds. That sense of wherever you could control nature, you would. And my dad, for years, his services were known for controlling dogs. If people had a difficulty with dogs, he would offer to control, again, part of the macho thing. And somebody had an Alsatian that they found very problematic. So my dad had an allotment, and he took this Alsatian down, and he decided to leave it for a few days, to make it hungry, so it'd be more controllable. And after a few days, he went to the allotment, and the dog had gone, and so had the shed he'd attached it to. So I think he gave up animal control after that. But that maybe that's part of it. Control nature where you can, because you're so dependent on it in other sorts of ways. So in the Mediterranean, I think, all those cultures of controlling bulls, the bull is meant to represent kind of an earthquake region. And I'm sure it's the same kind of agricultural, pre-industrial attitude of, control any forms of nature that you possibly can. And presumably you make yourself feel better that down the pit, in the driveways and stuff, you're never sure if you're going to come out alive or not. Well, it's a human drive often, isn't it? The will to form, to be in control of it, when most of the time nature just turns around and says, no, you can't.
How did nationalisation change people's lives?
I think it was held up as going to be an enormous change. But January the 1st, was it 49 or 48? I can't remember. But the first day, the story is that people went in and they were expecting that over the weekend, the roadways would have been painted white. You know, they were supposed to have lime dust and so on to stop explosions. It was very rarely done, I think. And they thought this would have been done over the weekend. And there's a line in a play called Close the Coal House Door. And somebody walks in and looks around and says, same bloody gaffers. Because a lot of people that were the coal owners, their sons, interestingly, had very high-level jobs in the NCB. So, you know, there was that continuity that wasn't expected. And of course you could say, well, it's the expertise and so on, but the sons took over in a cosmetic sort of way. But it did make a big difference, I think, in terms of the notion of, you know, ownership, having a different attitude to that. I think welfare improved a lot. The pithead baths. My uncle Jack, you know, got a job in the pithead baths, whereas before that, as you know, was the tin bath in front of the fire. But when there were baths at the pithead, the radiography service developed to look, you know, for pneumoconiosis and so on, silicosis on the lungs. I believe they were incredibly dangerous. The first X-rays, they gave them huge doses, which were probably more dangerous sometimes than that. But so an awful lot of things brought in, and there was a sense in which the NUM, you know, was really, really important and a central part of people's lives, and the welfare support systems were there. So, you know, I'm a child of nationalisation, born at the same time. So all I remember is that. But they did, you know, my parents and uncles and aunts talked about the 1930s and the bad old days where keeping your job was difficult, real hardship. I mean, my grandmother told a story of the family next door. So this was in the general strike, 26. The family next door being so hungry that they kept the curtains closed all day and pretended to their children that it was still night. So the kids woke up and they had nothing to feed them at all. So the mother and father kept the curtains closed and said, you know, why have you woken up? It's the middle of the night. And tried to keep them going for an extra day because they didn't have anything to feed them. So, you know, those kind of stories about the strike and so on. And my grandmother talked about the strike, and I've forgotten the leader now, coming to the Ashington welfare and standing on some straw bales and making this fantastic speech about why they were on strike. And why the straw bales were there, I don't know. But I think it was something to do with people were trying to occupy themselves. And I think they'd made the straw bales themselves in 26. And that, you know, ties back into like a pre-industrial background. But she talked about them standing on these, you know, on these bales, and that always seemed to be of interest to her, why the bales were there. So there's that. Privatization, again, I remember Ashington really in its heyday in the 70s. I know about going back in the 80s when Woodhorn closed in 81. My uncle Jim, who was part of the Ashington group of pitmen painters, him being part of the group that tried to keep the pit going, particularly to drain it, because there's so much water, as you know. So that was in 81, and my mother talking about how the levels of crime had just shot up. So instead of, you know, doors never shut, you know, all that classic stuff, you never lock your doors, you never needed to, she started to really worry as an old woman, you know, in a street where it would be possible that someone could come in and take a purse or worse. And that, you know, that breakdown, if you like, of the order that had been there because people had jobs and the pits were still going. And then I think Limeouth closed in 2007, 2008, and that was all privatized by that state. So I'm not able to say very much about the privatization except the effect on my mother. But that it was still the NCB then, but of the closure of Woodhorn and how the heart gets ripped out of the community. And more than the heart, before it passed to the Ashington group that were going to look after Woodhorn and create it into a museum, I believe the day before it was handed over by the NCB in its privatizing form, they actually blew up the chimney. So the heart, and you don't have to be a Freudian to see the implication of the chimney being blown up, something that's been 120 feet dominating that part of Ashington. But the day before it was blown up. So if you go to Woodhorn Colliery now in the museum, that part isn't there. And they have had to struggle. But privatization of so many things, I think, does lead to a precarious existence. Indeed, some people say that's exactly what it's about. Yeah, it is about making people's lives precarious. And the Thatcher government, I think, took on the miners, as is well known, because of the miners' success in the 1970s. And that's what I remember. The period of success rather than the defeats of the 80s. But for the people that still live there, it's not a great life. It's not a great life. Alcan, which was meant to replace it, is now closed. So you've got a situation in which, if it has been a masculine culture, how does that masculinity, assuming that you want to carry on with it, you may well not, but assuming that you do, how do you create industrial jobs? And there are very few of those. They've all been exported, to the east and the south.
Well, what's the effect collectively on a group of people when collectively they're emasculated? Or
Well, if your identity is pit village and there's no pit, the raison d'etre of it is taken away. So I think it's important that even though it's only 30 years ago, if that's what the village did, village is no longer able to do it, there's that loss of function. I think that the idea that a village is able to get over it suggests that there's some help. And I don't think Ashington's had a lot of help in any way, shape or form in terms of restructuring, in terms of what possibilities there have been. I think that's probably true across most of the coal fields of Britain, that has happened. So, I think that the emasculation is a useful way of thinking about it. Men had to deal with women getting jobs, and so there's been, some very healthy shifts in that sort of way, I think. Programs have been done about Ashington, but very much from the point of view of hopelessness, of the way in which the world is being lost. And that's certainly what my mother felt. My mother felt as if it had all gone, and for a brief 100-year period, the 1890s, not even to the 1990s, but for 90 years, it flourished as a community. But that's probably been true of lots of places across the planet at lots of points in time. But it doesn't help if you're still there. But one thing you didn't mention, Matthew, was the importance of education. And there's always been some emphasis, not totally, but some emphasis in Ashington on getting out for your children, often through sport that we've already mentioned, but often through education. But again, to benefit from the education system, you have to have confidence. There has to be a level of self-worth, and people, don't apply to university necessarily naturally. There has to be some way in which people believe that universities are part and parcel of the world they can inhabit. So education is a way, but I'm not aware of the schooling in Ashington at the moment, so I can't say very much about that, I'm afraid.
Why do you think people, Northumbrians sometimes, or people in the northeast, don't feel English?
It's partly the tyranny of distance, 300 miles from London. It's partly that Londoners show no interest in the northeast, I suspect. It is that lots of Southerners believe that the border is Hadrian's Wall. So Northumberland is always assumed by many in the south to be part of Scotland anyway. Interestingly, we had a conversation in our house last night saying exactly the same thing about, if the SNP were to win, it would be quite useful for Lancaster to join that particular group. So it's sense of self-identity, and it's partly the North. If you go back to the aristocratic thing about the Percys, the Dukes of Northumberland, they were liminal. They were part of the English establishment, and as we know, very well looked after in the English system, but also had lots of clout in Edinburgh, in Scotland. So Northumbria, in that wider sense, has always played a role, I think, in both borders. And of course, the Northumbrians also played a role in the rebellion that Glendower kind of led against the English. So the Northumberlands and Glendower got together, but got beaten at the Battle of Shrewsbury. But so there's some connection historically between the Welsh and the Northumbrians as well, and it's been reinforced through coal mining. So in Wales, exactly these same sorts of issues. But yeah, Northumberland I always thought is different. It's at the edge, and that edginess has meant it's often been kind of ignored. If you look at the way Newcastle United is treated, in the papers, it is that kind of it's of but not of us sort of thing. Yeah.